Well, hello and welcome to part two of this episode of the Quadruple D. I split it up into two parts because I got this cold, which is kind of wrecking my voice up a little bit. But hopefully, I'll make it through here in one take. Let's give it a try. So, I am talking about John McCain in this particular segment. So, let's look at his legacy and then I'll talk about George W. Bush in a little bit as well and look at their pro war legacies, the impact that they've had on the world. So during the 2008 Republican primaries, former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee surprised many observers by winning the Iowa caucuses. Still, the overall contest favored John McCain, who ultimately led in delegates and secured the party's nomination. Huckabee finished behind him in both delegate count and popular vote, even though his Iowa victory showed the strength of evangelical voters inside the GOP. So McCain was born in 1936 in the Panama Canal Zone. He came from a long line of Navy officers. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1958 and became a naval aviator. During the Vietnam War, he flew ground attack missions from aircraft carriers, and in July 1967, he narrowly survived the catastrophic fire aboard the USS Forrestal, which killed 134 sailors. A few months later, while flying over Hanoi during Operation Rolling Thunder, his plane was shot down. Captured and held until 1973, he endured torture and refused early release. He left prison with lasting injuries that limited his mobility for the rest of his life. And keep in mind that Trump actually belittled him for being caught. So remember remember that Trump said, I prefer when they don't get caught," or something like that, when he was confronted about this his views on McCain. So, this part of McCain's biography is inside a larger critique of US militarism, of course, because here is somebody who suffered the horrors of war and who apparently couldn't get enough of it because he really liked a lot of US wars. The Vietnam War killed millions of Vietnamese civilians and destabilized Southeast Asia. Operation Rolling Thunder alone dropped more tonnage of bombs than were used in all of World War II's Pacific theater. McCain's suffering as a prisoner of war was real, but it occurred within a conflict widely condemned as an imperial intervention driven by Cold War power politics rather than genuine self defense. So we really shouldn't lose sight of that. There's all this talk of McCain was a war hero and, you shouldn't make fun of him for that or whatever. And I do understand those views, especially in light of the intensive pro military propaganda that our national media loves to just constantly pump into people's brains. But, after retiring from the Navy as a captain in 1981, McCain moved to Arizona and entered politics. So that's kind of an insight into the way the military is sometimes used. It's used as an excuse by some people to say, "Hey, I'm a tough guy. I want to be tough as a politician because I was pro-military or was even in the military myself. Therefore, you should vote for me." So it's kind of cynically used as a way to convince voters that they're legitimate, that they're the best candidate. And it's similar to these fraudsters who have these, wealthy careers in some businesses. They're like, vote for me because I'm a successful business person. And a lot of voters out there, they're too stupid to understand that if you vote for people because they're successful business people, well, then they're going to have an excuse to rig the system in their favor. And I don't mean in their favor as in the favor of the voting public, but in favor of the wealthy. And that often means deregulation. And look, I know if some of you out there, you might be libertarian leaning, you might be against government regulations as a general principle. I understand that. But here's the thing, if you don't regulate corporations, they end up regulating you. You might think, oh, I don't like government, I don't like this, I don't like that aspect of it. I get that. But these corporations, they love government, believe me, most of the time. And you don't just have to be like a mega corporation in order to love government to some degree. A lot of these smaller businesses too, if they could get special treatment from the government, they would clamor for it as well. You know, and when it comes to McCain, going back to that, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1982 and then to the Senate in 1986. He served in the Senate until his death in 2018, representing Arizona for over 3 decades. And as a Republican, he generally supported tax cuts, a strong military posture, and deregulation, just like I was talking about. Yet he cultivated a maverick image by occasionally breaking with party orthodoxy. And that's one of the reasons why, back in the day, some people thought McCain might have been a relatively decent president or something like that. But the problem is, he would have been another warmonger president, just like so, well, practically all of them. And in the late 1980s, McCain became entangled in the Keating Five scandal, involving intervention on behalf of savings and loan executive Charles Keating. And although the Senate Ethics Committee did not find that he violated the law, the episode damaged his reputation and sharpened his interest in campaign finance reform. He later co sponsored the bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, often called McCain Feingold, alongside Democratic Senator Russ Feingold, who I looked into. I was maybe going to cover Russ Feingold in this episode, but honestly, I couldn't find that much dirt on the guy. I'm sure there's something in his history that is less than reputable, but I couldn't find anything in the search that I did. So, there wasn't enough juicy content to get out of that. So, anyway, the campaign finance law aimed to limit soft money in federal elections, though later Supreme Court rulings, especially Citizens United versus FEC, it weakened many of its provisions. So, definitely, Citizens United was a dark moment in the history of not only American politics, but really in the history of the world, if you think about it. And even 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 so, reforms like McCain-Feingold, even though they attempt to regulate the influence of wealth in electoral politics, they still leave intact a system in which corporate funding and state power remain deeply intertwined. So even something as good as McCain-Feingold wasn't good enough. And like I just said, the Supreme Court messed that up anyway with the Citizens United decision, where they decided that money equals free speech. In other words, corruption and bribery equal free speech. Figure that one out. So that's why there are calls to have publicly financed elections, so our elections are not rigged by, you know, big money interests like corporations and certain, uh, special interests like that. So McCain chaired the Senate Commerce Committee at various points between 1997 and 2005, and he criticized earmarks and pork barrel spending, framing them as wasteful. However, such spending debates often distract from the far larger scale of military budgets and corporate subsidies anyway. How come that kind of spending is almost never considered wasteful, especially by Republicans? They love, the corporate welfare stuff and the military budgets, even though there's actually plenty of waste, fraud, and abuse when it comes to military budgets. So during the 1990s, McCain supported restoring diplomatic relations with Vietnam. That's another part of his legacy that's interesting. And it kind of reflected a shift in U.S. foreign policy after the Cold War. So that seems like it could be a positive part of McCain's legacy, kind of. I'm sure there's some bad aspects to that as well. You know, it's likely that this was not done for the best of reasons. It was probably done mostly so we could award sweatshops in Vietnam. That's probably what was largely animating that sort of decision. But nevertheless, it's maybe a good thing. So in 2008, McCain became the Republican presidential nominee, ultimately losing the general election to Democrat Barack Obama. McCain's campaign emphasized national security experience and fiscal restraint. Both major parties in that election accepted the legitimacy of U.S. global military dominance, however, and the potentially lethal authority of centralized state institutions. So, all that was kept intact. And differences existed on social policy and regulation, but neither party challenged the underlying structure of capitalist governance or the concentration of mass destructive power in these federal institutions. Of course, McCain died in 2018 after battling brain cancer. He left behind a complex legacy. He was a war veteran, a long serving senator, advocate of certain campaign finance limits. He was also a critic of the use of torture. Of course, that was mostly because he was tortured himself. There's no real indication that he had much empathy aside from what he was inspired to feel based on his own experiences, which is, of course, a long-standing Republican pattern. And I'm sure plenty of Democrats are like that too. But it's a little disappointing when people just cannot put themselves in another person or group's shoes unless they've had literally the same exact experience or someone they know is going through the exact same situation or a very similar one. So, McCain was a consistent supporter of boy, I said American weird there, I almost said American, but American military power. And that was, despite his own negative experiences in the military. So he was obviously very ideological about that. I don't think it was just because he was corrupted by money interests. I think he was a true believer in using American military might around the globe. And to realists, I think his life would illustrate the contradictions of reform within a hierarchical political order. Personal integrity and occasional dissent did not alter the broader realities of war, state authority, and corporate influence that defined the system that he served. And they also did not totally change him. He didn't become a peacenik or whatever. So it's definitely a sign of some sort of ideological subservience to the military industrial complex. And it's a reminder that it's not always just about corruption. Sometimes it's a genuine belief that a person may hold that the United States has a God given right to go around the globe, stomping on other countries across the map. So, okay, the final segment, as promised, it's about George W. Bush. And obviously, McCain entered the race for the 2000 Republican presidential nomination, but he lost to George W. Bush. And part of that is because George W. Bush is kind of a likable, quirky guy if you put the politics completely aside. When people talk about the biggest scandal involving George W. Bush, though, they usually mean one of three things: his decision to invade Iraq in 2003. For many people, that's the biggest one. There's also the Abu Ghraib torture scandal. And Of course, more specifically, a lot of people focus in on the administration's false claims about weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. Some people see that as almost being a bigger scandal than the Iraq War itself. And I can kind of understand that, but the Iraq War was it basically destroyed that country all but totally. So, of those, the most widely considered as the biggest and most consequential is the Iraq War itself, though, and the false or misleading claims about WMDs, which were a part of it. So, let's look at the Iraq War and the WMD claims. After the September 11 attacks, the Bush administration argued that Saddam Hussein not only had weapons of mass destruction and posed an imminent threat, but there was also a lie that Saddam Hussein had a close relationship with Osama bin Laden and the Taliban and possibly Al Qaeda. They were just making stuff up so they would just lie their heads off and, give false presentations to the UN like Colin Powell, Colin Powell did. Colin, that I that's funny. His name is actually spelled like colon or like Colin, but he says it like colon. It's a weird thing to you know think about. And obviously, in 2003, the United States invaded Iraq because George W. Bush wanted it so bad, and he had a relentless media campaign to convince the US government and the American people that it was a cool idea. But there were no active WMD stockpiles that were ever found, and the administration exaggerated and misrepresented military intelligence to justify the war, surveillance, intelligence, whatever. And the conflict led to hundreds of thousands of Iraqi deaths. Well, probably more like, millions of deaths, if you really think about it. And especially if you tie in the previous Gulf War and all the sanctions that were genocide level sanctions. A lot of Iraqis were actually killed. There were thousands of American military deaths as well, massive regional instability. Before the United States invaded, there were no insurgents running around, bombing the country. There was no uh, ISIS. That was largely caused by the Iraq War. And that was a long-term geopolitical consequence, the creation of ISIS. So it wasn't a personal misconduct scandal, but it was definitely a scandal. The Iraq War was a policy decision with global consequences, and that's part of why we should see it as the defining controversy of his presidency. And clearly related was the torture scandal at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, where detainees were abused by U.S. personnel. Photos published in 2004 showed humiliation, beatings, and other mistreatment. The administration argued the abuse was the work of a few individuals, but it reflected policies and legal memos that redefined torture as enhanced interrogation, and it, of course, was something that the administration was actually defending. They wanted to be able to use torture. And I remember when I was debating in online forums with right wingers, some of them were defending the sexual abuse of people with broomsticks because they claimed, isn't that what you liberals do to each other all the time anyway, or something like that. That was an argument that I actually encountered. So they made a joke of it, the idea that, oh, all of these homosexual liberals and leftists, they assault each other with broomsticks all the time. Therefore, it's okay. Ha 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 ha. So funny. That's a real glimpse in Republican style humor. And I think I encountered that argument more than once when I was in a debate forum. So it was sort of a meme that was going around at the time. I don't know if any of you encountered any arguments like that when you were debating somebody online during the Abu Ghraib scandal, but I did. I know that's an anecdote sort of thing, but it's actually true. You're gonna have to take my word on that one. So, as I sometimes do on this podcast, I'm going to consider how George W. Bush's Iraq War actually helped validate the radical anarchic perspective on things. So remember, from an anarchist style perspective, the issue goes much deeper than whether Bush personally lied or misjudged intelligence, because anarchism is fundamentally skeptical of state power, especially centralized authority, militarism, and imperialism. So an anarchist analysis would likely focus on these structural issues just as much as anything else. So first, consider the state's monopoly on violence. The anarchist types, the goofballs, the extremists, would argue that the state claims that legitimate right to use violence belongs to them and them only. And the Iraq War becomes an example of how that power can be exercised on a massive scale with practically no accountability. A small group of political leaders made decisions that reshaped millions of lives. Well, it didn't just reshape them, it in some cases destroyed them. So the scandal in this view isn't just misinformation or disinformation, it's that a centralized state has the capacity to wage war at all, right? And then you've got the manufactured consent aspect of this. Many silly billy anarchist types draw on the idea that governments and media systems will shape public opinion to justify war. Well, what do you know? That's exactly what happened here. And from this angle, the WMD narrative shows how fear and nationalism can be mobilized to build support for military intervention. So the problem is not only deception, but a political system that incentivizes it. And the lack of accountability, the fact that nobody saw a prison sentence for lying us into a war or anything like that, that further proves that, hey, you can get away with all these lies. You can get away with mass slaughter campaigns that destabilize countries and essentially also destabilize the United States itself. And we also saw executive power expansion. Remember that after 9/11, the Bush administration expanded surveillance, detention, and executive authority. So policies like the Patriot Act brought in state power at home, and those dummy anarchist types would see this as a predictable pattern. Crises are used to justify permanent expansions of control. So, from that perspective, the Iraq War and related policies are not anomalies, they are examples of how state systems operate when they're given the opportunity. And what about that accountability part of this? Well, very few, I don't even know if any high level officials faced legal consequences for the decision to invade Iraq or for authorizing harsh interrogation techniques, torture, in other words. And those far left extremist anarchists would argue that this shows that political elites are structurally insulated from accountability in these hierarchical systems. So, that to me, I mean, even though I was sarcastically calling it a goofy, ideology, I would say that's a more balanced and accurate view than what the right wing media would say it was. So, it's worth noting that whether one sees the Iraq War as a scandal depends partly on their political framework. You know, supporters would argue the administration acted on flawed intelligence, but in good faith. And, the critics argue that intelligence was cherry picked or misrepresented, and a lot of it, I think, was made up. And the anarchist types who are so dangerous go further and question the legitimacy of the decision making structure itself. So I'll let you decide, should we question the nature of a government that lets politicians lie us into wars and then seems to actually reward them for doing so? Is there reason to be skeptical or downright hateful of such a system? You can comment on this if there's a comment section like on YouTube or whatever. And of course, like and subscribe, all that kind of stuff. So, all right, I'm going to give my voice a break and, you know, have a good one.